So welcome everyone, and welcome especially to our guest today, the Honourable Julia Gillard, who served as the 27th Prime Minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013. She is the first, and thus far, only woman to serve as Prime Minister of Australia, better than the United States is doing, and was previously Deputy Prime Minister. Ms. Gillard led the adoption of transformative national policies that included reforming Australian education from early childhood through the university, creating an emissions trading program, creating a national program to care for people with disabilities, restructuring the telecommunications sector, and advancing a national broadband network. Under her leadership, Australia was elected to serve on the United Nations Security Council. She is currently the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, both at King's College London and the Australian National University, Canberra. She is chair of the Global Charitable Foundation, Welcome, and of Beyond Blue, one of Australia's leading mental health awareness groups. She is a distinguished fellow of the Center for Universal Education at Brookings Institution. In addition to these many accomplishments, in October 2012, our guest gave one of the most famous speeches in recent world history. Now, for the benefit of our students who were in elementary and middle school when Prime Minister Gillard's words shot around the world, I'd like to show a clip of the speech.
I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to oppose the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition. And in so doing, I say to the Leader of the Opposition, I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever. The Leader of the Opposition says that people who hold sexist views and who are misogynists are not appropriate for high office. Well, I hope the Leader of the Opposition has got a piece of paper and he is writing out his resignation. Because if he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives, he needs a mirror. That's what he needs. Let's go through the opposition leader's repulsive double standards, when it comes to misogyny and sexism. We are now supposed to take seriously that the Leader of the Opposition is offended by Mr Slipper's text messages, when this is the Leader of the Opposition who has said, and this was when he was a minister under the last government, not when he was a student, not when he was in high school, when he was a minister under the last government. He has said, and I quote, in a discussion about women being underrepresented in institutions of power in Australia, the interviewer was a man called Stavros. The Leader of the Opposition says, if it's true, Stavros, that men have more power, generally speaking, than women, is that a bad thing? And then a discussion ensues and another person being interviewed says, I want my daughter to have as much opportunity as my son. To which the Leader of the Opposition says, yeah, I completely agree, but what if men are by physiology or temperament more adapted to exercise authority or to issue command? Then ensues another discussion about women's role in modern society, and the other person participating in the discussion says, I think it's very hard to deny that there is an underrepresentation of women, to which the Leader of the Opposition says, but now there's an assumption that this is a bad thing. This is the man from whom we're supposed to take lectures about sexism. And then, of course, it goes on. I was very offended personally when the Leader of the Opposition, as Minister for Health, said, and I quote, abortion is the easy way out. I was very personally offended by those comments. You said that in March 2004. I suggest you check the records. I was also very offended on behalf of the women of Australia when, in the course of this carbon pricing campaign, the Leader of the Opposition said, when the housewives of Australia need to do what the housewives of Australia need to understand as they do the ironing. Thank you for that painting of women's roles in modern Australia.
Wow. So we have a lot to talk about. What has changed? What has not? In 2020, the speech was voted the most unforgettable moment in Australian television history, and it prompted the Macquarie Dictionary of Australian English to broaden its definition of misogyny to include entrenched prejudice against women. So today, we are going to discuss misogyny and the path towards a more equitable world. So please join me in welcoming Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard.
Thank you very much.
What a powerful few minutes that was. And I know that you delivered that speech extemporaneously. Can you just share with us how that came about? What happened in that context for that moment for you to deliver that speech?
Yeah, there's a few things to understand about the Australian Parliament to try and get the context of that speech, which is unlike your House of Representatives or Senate, the Prime Minister is a member of the Parliament, and you need to go every day that the Parliament sits to a thing called question time, where the opposition can ask you any question they want without notice. So you get very practiced in having to just do things sort of, off the balls of your feet because you don't have any sense that they're coming at you. And for me as Prime Minister, this was a ritual day after day, so you get more and more used to it. It's very combative, it's very loud, there are a lot of interjections, the opposition yelling at you, so you work out ultimately how to make sure your voice can be heard in that kind of hurly-burly. And on this particular day, I was preparing to go to question time. And you could normally predict what question time was going to be about, technically without notice, but you would look at what the media was running that day and you'd be able to predict the opposition would be trying to value add to the political media story of the day. And the political media story of this day was that the man who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives had been unmasked as having sent some very sexist text messages. And I had supported him to become Speaker. Of course, I couldn't have known about the text messages at the time, but you don't want to let the facts get in the way of a good political attack. So I knew that the opposition would be poised to challenge me as someone who had supported a sexist. So I got ready for question time. I asked my staff to give me the Leader of the Opposition's, Tony Abbott's, most sexist statements. And so when you saw me quoting one of them, I was carrying those with me because I was intending, when I was asked a question, to use them with a flourish in the reply. But what actually happened is the opposition decided it didn't want to have question time. It wanted to move straight to a debate. So the speech that I gave is my speech in reply to the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott's, opening speech. And so my only opportunity to prepare as such was to write some handwritten notes while he was speaking to kind of guide my points in order, and then to get up and give it. And so in some ways that speech is the labour of a moment. In other ways, it's the labour of many years, because what you end up doing, your craft as a parliamentarian, is to get better and better at making your voice heard, and making your voice heard in difficult circumstances, including times that you've had no opportunity to prepare. We were talking before, and Paula generously said that it's still remarkable for someone to speak for that amount of time not having done written preparation. I've done longer than that. When I was Prime Minister, I went to speak at the Local Government Association, and I had a very elegantly written speech which I was going to deliver. My staff had worked on it, I'd worked on it, I'd read it through several times, and we'd made arrangements that it would be waiting for me at the podium when I got up to give the speech, but the person who did the introduction accidentally integrated it with her notes, and so she took the whole lot with her. So when I got to the podium, it was empty, and so I had to give that 50-minute speech off the cuff. So I've had a bit of practice.
Oh my goodness, our nightmare.
It was a bit of a nightmare.
So, what happened after you finished?
Well, I just sat down. In the House, the Prime Minister's here, there's the big table that you saw with the sort of goldish looking boxes, the dispatch boxes, and the opposition sits the other side. And the debate continued, so the next opposition speaker was called to speak in the debate. And I knew that, courtesy demanded that I kind of sit there until the end of the debate, and then there would be a vote, and we would win the vote because my political party and the allies that supported my government would vote down the substantive proposition that the opposition had moved. So I sort of sat down, I was kind of drumming my fingers thinking, I'm going to be trapped here for hours now. And so I swung round to one of the men you could see sitting behind me, Wayne Swan, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I said, I'm going to get the staff to run in my correspondence basket because I could be, amending letters, signing letters while the debate's happening. And he sort of looked at me really oddly and said, you can't give the je accuse speech and then settle down and do your correspondence. I'm like, so I swung my chair back. I thought, that's really odd, in all sorts of ways. Certainly Wayne is not the kind of bloke who breaks into French in any given moment. So I knew this was kind of odd. And so I wandered around, I wandered up to the advisors box. They too were of the view that I shouldn't write my correspondence. And so I just sort of waited until the end of the debate. And I knew that the speech had landed with a power in the House because you're very close, to the opposition. I mean, it's as close as I am to the people sitting in the front row. And so you can tell from the body language how something is being received, and I could tell that speech had been received as a powerful speech because they'd literally dropped their heads, but I really had no idea at the time that it was resonating beyond the chamber.
Yeah. No, fascinating. And it was pretty clear if you looked at Tony Abbott, who did become Australia's 28th Prime Minister. At the beginning, he's kind of smirking a bit, and then his face becomes quite serious. So in talking about Tony Abbott, and reflecting about what's happened here in the United States, we know that our 45th president was frequently described as misogynist in chief. And, I think if you could reflect a little bit on what women lose when their political leaders have these beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, here in the US, in Australia, in other parts of the world, Brazil, Hungary, so many places, we've seen misogyny and populist politics be fused together. They go hand in hand. And the political proposition that these figures are selling is basically to communities that feel that they've been left behind by economic change, social change, technological change, or all of them. They are selling to these communities a vision that they have been sold out by their political leaders, by elites, by the people who control things, And a big subset of that is to say, you know, they are losing out in part because elite women, privileged women are getting more. So, you know, it's a very deliberate political tactic to isolate you know, women's equality, isolate feminism, and to use it as a political rallying cry for populist politicians. I mean, there's a reason, for example, one of the things that Prime Minister Orban in Hungary did as soon as he came to office was to ban gender studies in universities. You know, there's a reason that that weaves in with the political sentiment. And of course, for women, that kind of populist politics means all of the causes that we need to keep pursuing for women to be truly equal end up taking a step back. So whether that, as is here, is reproductive freedoms and choices, whether that's the things that enable economic opportunity, the economic regulation or social safety nets, childcare, those kinds of things that enable women's labour market participation, whether it is about ending violence against women, tackling domestic violence, all of these things get characterised as sort of, you know, elite, you know, niche pursuits rather than the stuff that should be the mainstream of an equitable and progressive approach to politics. So for women, there is effectively everything to lose in this agenda.
Yeah. And you're right, the marginalization and the politicization becomes really the central theme. You know, we tend to think of misogyny as an individual state of mind. Can we think about this more as a societal state of mind? Can whole societies be misogynist?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually do think we've got to think about it like that, because if you characterise it as an individual state of mind, then the debate quickly runs to, well, you know, there are always just a few bad apples, aren't there? And, you know, if we could deal with those few bad apples, then everything would be fixed. And I kind of wish it was like that, because it would be simpler to fix than the actual truth. But the actual truth is, whilst individuals give expression to misogynistic views, society has embedded throughout it misogynistic and sexist structures and stereotypes which hold women back. I think they hold everybody back because they put on people, whether or not people want to feel the weight of them, they put on people predispositions about their roles in society and what they should be like as human beings. And so, you know, whether it's the systematic undervaluing of women's work, you know, there's a reason that the most feminised professions in our economies are comparatively the underpaid professions. You know, teaching, nursing, personal care work, these have been historically undervalued and underpaid because historically they've been sort of seen as, you know, women's work. They're the kinds of things that women are just naturally good at, therefore it can't be that hard, can it? Even though people go and do 3 or 4-year degrees or master's qualifications or PhDs in teaching or nursing, it's systematically undervalued. You know, that's one expression of this sort of sexism and misogyny. I mean, another expression of it is the dismissing of complaints about gender-based violence. So we've known over decades and decades now that, you know, if you go to a police station, you know, if I went to a police station and said my home's been burglarised, I would be believed on that. If you go and you report a sexual assault, then there's the sort of cloud of suspicion that descends as to whether or not it actually happened or you're making it up. You know, these things are quite systematised across our society. It goes all the way through to who holds the levers of power, whether it's in parliaments, the top of business, the top of media, the top of technology. Those levers are disproportionately in the hands of men. And it goes all the way through to, psychological predispositions. We've all been brought up in a gendered world, so we all have whispering at the back of our brains the stereotypes that come from that. So we can only address this huge, multifaceted series of issues if we recognise that there are structures and stereotypes, and to get rid of them, we need collective action. We need people coming together who want to rid us of this, baked-in inequality.
Yeah. No, it's so important. And when you said kind of the one bad apple approach, I've had the opportunity, and this is kind of something very important in higher education, to work on the issue of sexual harassment in higher education, where we really have taken that one bad apple. It's one person, remove the person, and the problem will be solved. And the problem has not been solved. And it's much more of a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. You mentioned abortion, and it was mentioned in the speech, and obviously we had the very unfortunate Dobbs decision handed down that really states that no longer do American women or other people who can become pregnant have the legal right to abortion. Can you just tell us your thoughts on the decision?
Yeah, I'd like to say I was shocked, but I wasn't, because, this has been a campaign decades in the making, very systematically pursued, and it's been pursued by a coalition of, what I would characterise as people who genuinely believe, for faith-based reasons or other reasons, genuinely believe that abortion is wrong. There are people of that view, and it's very deeply and sincerely held. But the people with those beliefs, I think, have had this sort of right-wing populist politics come and take their beliefs and weaponise them for political advantage. So, election after election here in the US, part of what the Republican right has done to get the vote out is to campaign on changes to abortion law, to campaign on changes to the composition of the Supreme Court, and to say, if you come and vote for us another time, we'll ultimately get this done. And I actually think amongst that very knowing, even cynical political class who was riding this issue for votes, I think there was probably a degree of concern when the Supreme Court decision came down, because for them this was a political tool that they wanted to keep using for the future to keep rallying the vote, rather than actually deal with the reality of what it means when Roe v. Wade is swept away, and then abortion law is at a state level, and states are making all sorts of different decisions, and women are needing to cross borders, and national employers and healthcare providers and insurance companies are having to respond. But no one should underestimate how calculated all of this has been, and it does mean that in the response it requires the same degree of mobilisation and sort of disciplined campaigning over time to push it back the other way.
Yeah, and coalition building.
And
that has
coalition
really
building.
been absent in many ways in the movement.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Absolutely. It's different in Australia, and it's partly different because we have compulsory voting, Now, that doesn't mean that someone holds your hand and makes you vote for someone, but it does mean that you are required to be registered to vote. You are required to go and vote, go and get your ballot paper when there is an election on, to put your ballot paper in the ballot box. If you want to put it in blank, you of course are free to do that. If you want to put it in having written on it a 4-letter word which best summarises your attitude to politics, you're at liberty to do that, and people do take that choice. I've seen those ballots come out and be counted, well, not counted, discarded, but everybody's kind of, you need to have a chuckle when you're watching thousands of votes get counted, so that obviously creates a frisson during the count. But overwhelmingly it means people vote and they vote validly, and so using an issue like abortion to get the vote out is not necessary. And when you've got the vast mass of people voting, mainstream opinion about reproductive choices is that people, possibly don't want to think about the details all that much, but they are content for people to go and see medical professionals and to work out what they're going to do. And they're not that interested in people who are campaigning for government, the state, to come in with heavy-handed regulatory approaches. And so the dynamic in Australia is very different, and no mainstream political party campaigns on abortion.
Yeah. So the compulsory voting is fascinating because, in our quest in the United States for freedom of choice, in many ways, this has led to suppression of our freedom.
Yes, yeah. We in Australia watch all of that, and we can read it and understand it, but it's so alien to how elections are run in Australia. So we have an independent body, the Australian Electoral Commission. It is accepted as independent by all sides of politics. No one has ever mounted a credible case that it was politically biased in any way. It draws the boundaries, for seats. So what happens here routinely with the, gerrymandering doesn't happen. And it's responsible for registering people to vote, for administering the vote, and for working out how to reach very hard to reach communities. So for example, in Australia's a big country, there are communities in outback Australia, Indigenous Australians and others who live literally thousands of miles from major population centres. So the Australian Electoral Commission will work out a program to fly in people to sit with the community and to make sure that people end up getting to vote. So the whole setting is how can we make it easier, not how can we make it harder. And on election day, there are polling places there very routinely in schools, and it's a bit of a festival, like local youth groups and others come and barbecue sausages, and people pay a gold coin or a few gold coins and get, where they're jokingly called democracy sausages, and you go to the polling place and you have your sausage and you go and have your vote and all the rest of it, and it's in many ways got that bit of a community festival feel about it. And it's very efficiently done. If people need to queue half an hour, everybody's like, what's going on? Why am I here for half an hour? And when I was a local member of parliament, I used to walk up and down the line saying, oh, for heaven's sake, people around the world fight and die for the right to vote. You can stand up for half an hour and wait your turn. They're like, oh, okay. We just don't have the comparable thing.
Lessons for us to honestly, for us to look at. So the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, where your chair was a co-sponsor of our forum focused on the economy she deserves, i.e. the gender pay gap and some of the things that have led up to that. And we all know that the pandemic really illustrated how women's opportunities are unequal to that for men. What do you think are some of the ways forward?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting time of economic change. I mean, I think as the pandemic hit and lockdowns hit around the world and in that forum, I mean, we were talking about, you know, the fact that the biggest economic impacts were felt in industries that were quite feminised, retail, hospitality, tourism-facing industries. They were the ones that had to shutter first because of the pandemic. We were talking about the way in which homeschooling, extra domestic labour was disproportionately falling on the shoulders of women. And we were talking about the fact that women were more likely to be in casual and insecure employment, and depending on which country you were in the world, the pandemic payments that supported employees might not have extended to employees in those categories. So there was a lot going on for women. Of course, domestic violence rates increased too. I think coming out of well, we're not beyond the pandemic, but as you know, we've come out of the lockdown cycle of the pandemic. Obviously, not every job can be done virtually. Many jobs require in-person attendance. But I do think with this now hybrid and virtual world of work, there is an opportunity, if we seize it and get it right, to make some long-term shifts, which would be better for everyone because they would give more work-life balance and flexibility. But because we know domestic work disproportionately falls on the shoulders of women, would be better for women. But we at the Institute are very focused on how thoughtful we're going to have to be to get there, because if we just let it all happen, you know, employers who feel like they're doing the right thing by offering a lot of flexibility, but who keep their normal structures of promotion and definitions of merit and mentoring and sponsorship arrangements the same, we're at risk that, you know, women end up choosing to disproportionately work from home because of their family responsibilities. Men end up disproportionately choosing to go more routinely to the office, and a proximity bias takes over where an employer, a CEO, you know, someone else who's got leadership capacity at work ends up saying, well, you know, I always see, you know, John in the office, in there early, working late, you know, at my elbow when I need someone to assist me, and the work of the women will be less visible, and consequently we'll see that in promotion outcomes and other career achievements. So we think this has to be very carefully thought through if we're going to get it right.
Yeah. I guess the question is, you know, as we think about the attitudes of employers, you know, we have some recent examples. Elon Musk is one, and what did he say? On Twitter, of course, asking employees to commit to being extremely hardcore and working long hours at high intensity. Now, many employers won't say that, right? But there's a way in which there may be implications, as you're saying. You know, how do you think we go about changing those attitudes? Because there's the making, as you said, the work remote, but then there's changing the attitudes of what is valued.
Yeah, I think this is a really complicated issue. I do think in many businesses that are being far more thoughtful about these things than Elon Musk, you are increasingly seeing a recognition that you know, sort of burnout culture where and many, I mean, you know, before I was in politics, I was in the law, and there was no doubt that the tempo of the law in those days was, you know, you came in as a junior lawyer, you worked, you know, every hour you physically could, routinely on weekends. You know, you were always in the office, you were always turning the work over. And if you did that for enough years, then you would become an associate. And if you did that well for enough years, then you'd become a partner and you'd hit the payout counter. But, you know, it was just expected that people would be there. I mean, you know, I used to get in at 7 in the morning and I most assuredly wasn't the first person in the office. You know, it was just expected that you would be there incredibly early and there incredibly late. And, you know, in an industry like law, you've seen many firms recognise over time that this isn't the smartest working culture because a lot of people can't hack it. They drift away, you lose talent, people get tired, they make bad mistakes. You know, it's not the way that people want to live now, so you don't end up attracting the best and the brightest. And many have moved to a better understanding of part-time work, flexible work, moderating hours. And so if it's possible in places like that, which at the end of the day are very cost-focused, you know, they want people generating, you know, money for the law firm, you're charging out your time. If in an environment like that people can think it through and diversify, and you can see leadership from the top, that the partners are also using these flexibilities, then I think you can change work culture. But it does require, you know, considerable effort, and it does worry me that particularly in the economic times that we're in now, and particularly because the Elon Musk sort of approach is resonating around the world, that we'll see a lapse back to those earlier structures which weren't good for people's physical health, mental health, ultimately not that good for the business because your productivity in your 14th or 15th hour at work is not that high, and certainly not good for people who want to integrate family responsibilities.
Yeah. And it seems like the need for, and this is, I know, one of the areas the Institute in terms of the research that you're doing, the need for good data, and good data that can really be viewed across an entire industry or across industries, because you don't change what you don't know.
No.
And I mean, I think that the work you're doing in this area is really just outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you have been the victim of, or the target, I should say, of so many attacks, personal attacks, sexist attacks. How do you deal with that? What are the ways that the mechanisms that you've used to kind of move through it?
Yeah, it sort of comes back to the discussion we've had that, you know, misogyny isn't an individual act. So in some ways, getting through it requires you to recognise that it's actually not about you as an individual. You know, there would be political days where there were people holding up signs at rallies which used words about me which I won't repeat in this company, but you know, swear words routinely used about women. There was social media that was just, you know, absolutely toxic. Rape threats, death threats, you know, all of the above. There was the distribution of pornographic cartoons, that happened. The opposing political party recycled insults that had been originally used against Hillary Clinton. You know, once again, won't go through exactly what was said, but a comparison to a chicken, which, you know, was done deliberately for offence. You know, there was echoes of this. Obviously, our newspapers would not use words or imagery as blatant as that, but there was a like version of it. So they wouldn't use the swear words, but there was still a lot of, you know, Lady Macbeth style imagery that was used. And if you woke up every morning and said, this is only happening because of me, the individual, this is somehow a reflection of, you know, my unique self, then you wouldn't have been able to get through it. But it wasn't happening because of that, it was happening because I'm a woman. And if another woman, if I'd magically disappeared one day as Prime Minister and magically a new woman had appeared the next day as Prime Minister, it would have happened to her. So it's, and once you get that sense, then you can build a protective barrier, because it's not really about the inner you, it's about the role that you're playing and the office that you hold. And so I ultimately could think about these things in a very dispassionate way, read the worst of it in a very dispassionate way, knowing that in many ways it wasn't inherently about me. So it's a very different thing than being criticised by a friend or someone you respect, who would be offering that criticism in a constructive way, in which case you would, react to it, think about it, think, yes, this is about me, they are trying to tell me something about myself and something that I could potentially improve about myself. You wouldn't have it in that basket, you would have it in a completely different basket.
And you were also thinking about the greater good, right? The work that you were really there to do, which, was truly outstanding, and all of the change you made. So my last question is really focused on our students, which is that women are so often criticized. The choices we make, the ways of our being, the ways that we do things, and not that there is any one way, but in all the ways we've been talking about today. What advice would you give our amazing students, most of whom look like they're on this side of the audience, for addressing misogyny when they encounter it? And maybe part of that is recognizing it, but if you could share with us some words of wisdom before we move on to questions.
I'll do my best, and I'll leave it to you to judge whether they're truly wise. But I had the opportunity to co-author a book with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was a Nigerian politician. She was finance minister and foreign minister. She now leads the World Trade Organization, which in this world is not a job for the faint-hearted. And we co-authored a book on women and leadership, where we interviewed women leaders and we looked at the academic research, and we were trying to test propositions coming from that research in the lives of women leaders. And we did that as a sort of handbook for young women coming forward. And we ended up basically saying at the end of it, you are in the position where you've had the opportunity to see this movie before. Many of us, who came through to be the first, to be the first one contesting the election, to be the first one holding the office, to be the first woman who got to be CEO of that company, whatever. We didn't have the template, we didn't have the handbook, because it couldn't be had, because no one had been in that position before. Now, because there have been women who have been in those positions, you can see how they were treated, and you can think to yourself in advance, what will I do if that moment comes to me? You don't have to be blindsided or surprised. You can get ready in advance, war game it with the best of your allies and friends. And it might be that you war game it through and you think, if that happened to me, I would call it out, I would raise it, I would require the structures and the systems to respond to my complaint. And, I'm a big advocate for that strategy, for calling it out. But I also know that there are plenty of times when you're in a stage of your life where you don't feel empowered like that. It's one thing to stand in the House of Representatives as Prime Minister and give that speech. It's another thing when you're the newest recruit, the newest intern in an environment where you really want to prosper and you really want to work. It's a different thing then to be the one who calls it out. And so that then requires, I think, collectivisation, a coming together, an identification of allies and supporters who would work with you if this moment came, and who would call it out with you or for you if you weren't in a position to do it. And I think if we think about it like that, it creates a support sort of service around women who are coming forward now, and it creates an obligation on those of us who have gone before to make sure that we're always thinking about how we can give of ourselves into those structures and be the one that, potentially because we're in the more empowered position, or the position where we're harder to get rid of, harder to dismiss, that we're the ones that take on the obligation to call it out when others can't.
Yeah, no, it's so important what you're saying. The bottom line is, do not go it alone, and that the creation of these relationships, whether they be in the workplace to bounce things off of, whether it be with peers, whether it be with mentors. And I think our students are fortunate enough to have over 30,000 alumni who are ready and willing to serve in so many ways. And I think this is one of them, is people who they can bounce things off of and not be alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, one of the things I can certainly say about politics is I had fantastic women colleagues who are still great friends today, and we routinely would. We were of that generation where our political party was starting to change. There were more women coming into the parliament, but it was still a very male environment, and there would be plenty of days where we would, grab each other and get in a room and say, can you believe that? Did that really happen? I mean, what should we have said? What should we have done? Who's going to do something about this now? And so that sense of solidarity was really vital.
So important.
Yeah.
Well, I think now I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. And I think we have a roving mic. There's one right there in the back. When you ask, if you could just say your name, and if you're a Wellesley student, what class, what year you're in.
Hi, my name is Ozzy. I am a first year, and I'm really happy that you're here.
Thank you.
I had a question. Recently, there was a meeting between New Zealand's Prime Minister and Finland's as well, I believe, and the reporters asked for a justification as to why they were meeting, such as perhaps they're both women or they're around the same age. And I wanted to ask, why do you think this reporter would feel that this was a question to be asked, as when male prime ministers meet or anyone, there's no such question? And perhaps what must be required before questions like this are no longer asked? And I feel like I read something by Ruth Bader Ginsburg where a reporter asked how many women would be on the Supreme Court before there was enough, and she said 9. And of course this was like, oh my goodness, why this particular number? But for there to be 9 white male people on the Supreme Court, and for that to be such a common thing, and perhaps it's very difficult to believe in such a thing of women being on the court, would it take time before questions like this are no longer asked, or perhaps something in the present moment that can happen?
Yeah.
That can silence this.
That was a moment for anybody who missed it. Both the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the Prime Minister of Finland are comparatively young women for politics, particularly the Prime Minister of Finland. And so when she travelled to New Zealand, and they had the bilateral meeting, and then you're very familiar with that image of the two leaders come out to speak to the press. There was a question which was literally, the two of you meeting together because you're sort of women of a comparable age. No, we're meeting together because we're prime ministers and we've got things to talk about, like trade and, security issues and geopolitics and climate change and sexism. So it would never have been asked of a man. That's absolutely right. And I thought they gave it a pretty good smackdown in the press conference, which was great. I don't I mean, I was actually a bit surprised about that question. Not that people wouldn't think it. I was a bit surprised anybody was dumb enough to say it. But, you know, I do think mostly the media now get that if their reporting is seriously sexist or misogynistic, that there will be a backlash. I think they increasingly get that. But they only get it not because they've had some, you know, awakening of consciousness. They only get it because when they do those things, they get slammed. And so, you know, that campaigning to keep up, to keep a spotlight on these things and to keep pointing them out is really important. I mean, one thing that's really struck me here in the US, I thought the 2016 campaign involving Hillary Clinton was incredibly gender biased, incredibly, and not as much called out as it should have been. Whereas by the 2020 campaign with Vice President Harris, you know, if things were said about her which were sexist or racist or both, which did happen, people did get on social media and they did push back immediately. And I do think the campaigning to do that very much matters. I speak to journalists and people from the media about these things, and I always just basically say, rewrite the sentence or rephrase the question, changing it around. So if you are about to write, as they routinely do, you know, Prime Minister, so about a woman Prime Minister, you know, Prime Minister Susie wearing a red jacket and black pants, comma, mother of two, comma, today appeared at the World Trade Organisation to talk about tariff barriers. Ask yourself whether you really would have gone, you know, President Biden, comma, wearing dark suit, blue tie, white shirt, comma, father of, comma, whether you really would have done that. And the answer, of course, is no. And so if you wouldn't have, then don't do it for the woman. I think it's a really easy test.
Great, thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Sydney, I'm a first year, and I'm very impressed by the way you were able to handle the people of the opposition when you were giving your such a passionate speech. I was wondering if you had any advice to us as students who may be also very passionate, but you also are very under control in that moment. And I was wondering if you had any advice on how to speak in the moment passionately without getting very, aggressive.
Yeah. Look, more than anything else, it's practice. I mean, this is a learnt skill. It's not an inherent skill. And I was, in some ways, practicing that all the way from high school debating all the way through. You know, I went high school debating with two girlfriends of mine in our school as a bit of a lark. We thought it would be funny. And then ended up debating an all-male team on the proposition that the man should lead, and we had the yes case. So, you know, the universe sometimes has a sense of humour. But we, you know, from there, student politics into politics, it's a learned skill. And I also think there's a conversation to be had about anger, which is, I think we very much teach young women and girls that anger is an ugly emotion, that if you're feeling angry, then it's your responsibility to kind of tamp it down. It's your responsibility to make sure everybody in the group is feeling comfortable. But I do think that there is a way of sitting coolly in your anger when it is anger about an injustice that can then help propel you in the way that you articulate it. So I at no time in delivering that speech felt hotly angry or out of control, but I did feel coolly angry. And I think that's something that partly able to do because the circumstances had delivered me a time where the frustrations I'd been feeling could be brought to the fore, but it's also partly just the years of honing the craft of public speech making.
Yeah. Great lessons, I think, for our students as we think about letting controversial issues in and really thinking through how we respond, not pushing them away, but really saying this is part of that practice that will serve you incredibly well, and it's kind of foundational to our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is plenty about campaigning and a lot of community outreach that also gives you practice in dealing with people and in dealing with gendered moments. I mean, I've joked about this in the past, but when I was a much more junior MP campaigning in my local electorate, and you stand next to one of those clapperboard things that's got a big photo of you on it, you know, Julia Gillard, my electorate was called Lawler, with this very nice photo of me on it. So I'm standing next to that in, you know, it's a bit rainy, a bit windy, I'm handing out leaflets, and this old man comes by and says, looks at the thing and looks at me and looks at the thing and looks back at me and says, "Taken on a good day, wasn't it, love?" And, you know, things like that happen all the time, and the other weapon is humour. And I said, "And you'd be bloody Robert Redford, would you, mate?"
I love it.
To which he laughed and said, "I'm going to vote for you." I said, "Well, you better after that, off you go." You know, the community outreach does enable you. You meet a lot of people who say a lot of things, and you're trying to get them to vote for you. So you can't just walk away, and you can't get into, you know, an unpleasant, you know, sort of escalating argument. You've got to find a way of diffusing it or finding some common ground. And, you know, he realised when I quit back that it had been a silly thing to say. So there are ways through it which enable you to deal with something which on the surface could have been viewed as pretty offensive.
Fabulous. Professor Goddard, I thought you... Is there another? I don't think so. You've got the last question.
Well, first, I think I'm going to get "sitting coolly in my anger" embroidered on a pillow or something like that. It might be the best phrase ever. You spoke really eloquently about the ways in which misogyny has become central to anti-democratic movements, talking about feelings of inequality and being left behind. But it does raise the question, if that's become so central, how do you mobilize against that type of movement? How do you make that effective?
Yeah. Well, I think there's been a real-life case study here in the midterms, which shows, you know, I mean, obviously the midterm elections were about more things than the Dobbs decision, but you know, that was a big element, I think. I mean, a big element directly in its own terms, that people thought that the restriction of reproductive choices was wrong. But I also think it was an emblem of things of there's the capacity for things here to just get more and more crazy, too much crazy. And ordinary people, and I mean ordinary not in a prejudicial way, I just mean, you know, people who living their lives, doing their thing, going to work, you know, families, kids, dogs, houses, whatever, people in all of the many millions of ways that people pursue their lives and their life choices obviously decided that it was, you know, time to go and try and deal with this at the ballot box. Now that didn't just all happen spontaneously, it happened because people were out there campaigning and explaining the consequences, and, you know, from President Biden down, saying that democracy is on the ballot. So I think when people are, you know, there's good campaigning and people are called on, they can do some remarkable things. And I mean, I was not a believer that the midterms were going to end up the way that they ended up. I was very, very worried that they were going to end up with many Republicans elected. And I've joked with people that I'd put this on to watch it. I was in London, so watching the results in the morning, I was like a kid at a horror movie, sort of just peeking out in between my fingers because I thought it would be so bad, only to see that, you know, people had stood up for democracy. And I think it was a narrow contest, but I think people have stood up against populism in Brazil, and you know that really matters. The fact that you know, President Macron was re-elected, you know, that was people standing up for democracy. Yes, there are indicators the other way, Sweden, Italy, but you know, I've got the sense that people now are feeling the weight and the need to be standing up in their nations for more democratic practices. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic than I was a couple of years ago.
And some of that was really across party lines, which I think is quite powerful. I know. Do we have?
I think there was a question.
You know what?
Here
We're
from
gonna,
a student.
if we could, we're going to end the program because we have live stream, but maybe offline we'll take a couple more questions. So, Prime Minister Gillard, first of all, thank you for your leadership, your extraordinary leadership, which continues. And I think that's another powerful lesson for all of us, that you held office and your leadership was transformational, and you've continued making change, and we are tremendously grateful. And thank you for sharing so much about your leadership, your life, and we are fighting and continuing that journey against misogyny. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.